A brother from Canada sent me this video. Before I make my comment, just take a look for yourself. Now, initially I thought this may be a creative dawah video. You know how Islam is spreading and the beautiful scenes of Muslims performing salah. I'm like thinking I can get behind this message. Even the words wake up Canada could be interpreted as wake up to your iman, or wake up to the reality of this life full of distractions, and wake up to the next life, which is the real eternal life. That's until the last statement where it says you are under siege. So obviously this is some far-right anti-Muslim, anti-Islam propaganda that attempts to create an irrational fear of Muslims and Islam as a threat, who are controlling you, or who are, putting you under siege, or Canadians under siege, taking over, you are being oppressed. It seems funny and pathetic at the same time. But what's really pathetic is that messages like this are believed. And that's because the very best form of propaganda are those that prey upon ignorance, vulnerabilities, and prejudice of its audience. And this does this perfectly. Firstly, there's only 5% of Muslim population of Canada. I'm not sure how they'll take over. But what's really ironic here is how it mentions Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. You see, just a cursory understanding that the average non-Muslim would have about these countries is that they're a mess, civil war, death, destruction, etc. So the image that this propaganda is trying to portray, that Canada could become just like Yemen, Syria, or Iraq. And what's the common factor between all these three countries? Well, they are filled with Muslims. Therefore, if Canada has a larger Muslim population, would Canada also suffer from this? Would Canadians also suffer the fate of these so-called barbaric Muslim lands that exist? Now, I said it's ironic, and that's because the irony is that these are three countries that have been bombed by Canada. You see, ignorant people jump to conclusions that here are three majority Muslim countries all mired in death and destruction. Therefore, it's Muslims. It must be Muslims that are the problem. But it's ignorant and completely misses that these are three countries that have suffered direct and indirect Western interference for decades, going back to the colonial period. Let's take, for example, Yemen. While this piece of propaganda accuses Muslims of placing Canada under a siege, Canada has been involved in bombing targets in Yemen just as recently as this year. Canadian government will claim that they are trying to lift the embargo on Israeli shipping or ships supporting Israel. But the fact remains, and I don't support the Houthis, but their stated aim for preventing these ships was to help stop the genocide in Gaza. You know, the one that the International Court of Justice are currently investigating, and the one that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, are currently preparing an arrest warrant on Netanyahu. Even then, before the Houthis blockaded the Red Sea, the UN accused Canada on the 17th of September 2020 of fueling the war in Yemen. And also the organisation known as the Public Service Alliance of Canada signed a letter urging Trudeau to end arms export to Saudi Arabia after Canada was cited for fueling Yemen war. So who is causing the mess in Yemen? Who's helped mire it in civil war, destruction and recent famine? Who's bombing Yemen, basically? Similarly, let's take Iraq, that was invaded in 2003. Although Canada didn't formally declare war on Iraq, Canadian soldiers undertook military operations with US soldiers, including Canadian Air Force flying combat missions in Iraq. It's pretty clear then that Canada was involved in military operations in 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq. Similarly, the news outlet Ottawa Citizen headlined that Canadian Special Forces were involved in a US military team accused of killing scores of innocent people in Iraq, Syria. Canada itself were involved in the kidnapping and torture of its own citizen, a Syrian-born Canadian national known as Maher Arar. Canadian intelligence provided information on their citizen with the knowledge that he was going to be kidnapped by CIA operatives, euphemistically called extraordinary rendition. He was taken off a flight going back to Canada, his home country, and then was flown off to Syria under the brutal Bashar al-Assad regime, where he was tortured. The Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologised for Canada's role in Arar's terrible ordeal. Maher received a legal settlement in that case as well. Yes, I know all of the ills of the Muslim world cannot be placed at the feet of Canadian government and its policies. We know Canada is a satellite state that largely revolves around American interest and geopolitics. But the point is that it's not Islam and Muslims that have caused the mess in the Muslim world. You can't claim the problems boil down to Muslims when the very countries pointed to by these ignorant far-right people, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, are the very countries that are bombed and invaded and occupied by their own nations. And the current leadership in the Muslim world has its origins that go back even to Western states that have colonized the region. And now we live in a neo-colonial Muslim world. The very same leaders continue to be propped up by Western states like Canada. And this isn't just me, a Muslim, who states this, but Western academics like Professor David Fromkin, an expert on economic history at the University of Chicago, who also stated that Britain and France created small, unstable states whose rulers needed their support to stay in power. The development and trade of these states, i.e. Arab states, were controlled, and they were meant never again to be a threat to the West. These external powers then made contracts with their puppets to buy Arab resources cheaply, making the feudal elite enormously wealthy while leaving most citizens in poverty. So which states were being made unstable by these colonial powers? Which states had their leaderships imposed over them? And which states continued to serve the interest of other Western states like America, Britain, and also to a lesser extent Canada? These are Muslim and Arab countries. And therefore it's not Islam that's the problem. It's not that there is a majority Muslim country. These are countries that were created to be unstable, as mentioned by Professor David Fromkin. And so it's absolutely clear the problem of the Muslim world isn't because of Islam, but because of Western interference in the Muslim world. Either they control its leadership or they invade and bomb the country so that it can never be a threat. That's their policy. As for Muslims in Canada and overcoming the Islamophobia, we need to properly explain the political situation in the Muslim world and the complicity of Western states in creating the instability in the Muslim world. We need to articulate that secular capitalist societies leave an ever-increasing vacuum in the lives of ordinary people in the West, while allowing capitalist elites and the political establishment to create havoc and war across other parts of the globe for their own selfish political interests and economic interests. It actually serves the political establishment of the West to point the finger at the Muslims, claiming they are the problem. Because if the anger is not pointed at minorities like Muslims, then perhaps people will start to wake up and realize where the real problem lies. Not only the political establishment, but its decadent, immoral ideology too, that leads to the oppression of peoples around the world to serve just a minority of interest. So yes, Canada, please wake up, but wake up really to the truth and not be sold this lie that only serves the very political establishment that wants you to be distracted away from the real problem, which is that they exist within a secular capitalist ideology, and point it towards the Muslims, who are, quite frank, 5% of the population, or less than 5% of the population of Canada. Wake up, Canada.